Hello dear friends. Hello dear friends. We are on the Jerulita YouTube channel again, and we are doing virtual tours in Vilnius. We have been to many shtetls, and today we are in the main city of Lithuania, in Vilnius, in Vilna, and we do episode about Jewish cemeteries. So I walk between the two rows of stones, former headstones. Some of them were used as steps, some of them were used for construction, so some of them are not recognizable as former headstones, some of them are clearly former headstones with Hebrew letters on them. The old cemetery was first time mentioned in historical records in 1487, and it was used until 1831, when it was filled with headstones and the authorities closed it. So this is the sign saying in three languages, Lithuanian, English and Hebrew, that here was the old Jewish cemetery. Under the Soviet regime there were no signs mentioning that here was an old Jewish cemetery. So this cemetery was the necropolis of many famous Jews of Vilna, including the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Danzig, the family of the Vilna Gaon, Baruch Romm, the founder of Romm printing house, and many other famous and not very famous Jews. One of the famous stories here is the story of Ger Tzedek, Graf Valentin Potocki. We'll tell you the story of Graf Valentin Potocki a little bit later. Now here you can see the big gray building, a former sports hall, which was built just on the cemetery. And my father, who was a child when this building was constructed, he recollects that they were running back and forth here with children, with other kids, and they saw bones in the piles of land, of soil, which was dug out to build the basement for this building. So now we come closer to the memorial. It consists of two parts. The lower part is built of former headstones, and the upper part, with an inscription in Yiddish and Lithuanian language, says that here was the old Jewish cemetery, and also here were graves of Gdolei Israel, the famous people of Israel, including the Vilna Gaon and Graf Valentin Potocki, or Count Valentin Potocki, whom we have already mentioned. So the picture of this memorial can be seen in every guidebook of Vilnius, which also is a new thing, that Jewish highlights, the highlights of the Jewish history, are included into the guidebooks. So the cemetery was destroyed twice. First time by the Russian Tsar army in the early 1800s, and the second big destruction was during the interwar period, and also during the Second World War. After the war, when the city authorities made plans of reconstruction of the city, they decided to build sport halls here. So there was a swimming pool, the sports center, and also a stadium later on. So from the old cemetery, which was used up until 1830s, we come to the second cemetery, which was used from 1830 to up until 1930s, so over 100 years. As the Jewish community was much bigger then in the 19th century, the number of graves on this cemetery grew very fast, and it reached 70,000. So here you can see the column, which is part of the memorial in honor of the second cemetery. So somewhere here was the gate to enter the cemetery, And the memorial was erected in 2004, and it consists of one of the two columns of the gate, symbolic, that there were two and only one is still here. And then the memorial itself, which consists of headstones which were polished into steps and used for construction. On some of these stones we can see Hebrew letters, Hebrew inscriptions. Some look like tombstones, some are polished into steps. Here is, for example, the headstone in honor of a woman, Shifra, who died in 1931, and some more headstones with Hebrew letters. So now we are on a hill, and we see some remnants, some concrete parts of the graves of the cemetery. So the cemetery was on two hills, the left hill and the right hill, and the right hill was older and this one was newer. So the desecration took place here in 1960s, when the city authorities decided to take out all the remaining stones from this cemetery. After the desecration of the Jewish cemetery, on this part of the cemetery, funeral bureau of the Christian cemetery was erected. This happened in late 1960s. A lot of famous people were buried on this cemetery, as it was started in 1830s, so some local rabbis and founders of the printing house, and Menachem Romm and his widow Dvora Romm, the famous Romm printing house. Chaim Grada, the author from Vilna, he uses this cemetery as one of the stages for the events in his novel. Matityahu Strashun was a famous book collector. He was also buried on this cemetery. The library by his name was next to the great synagogue. Tzemach Shabbat was a famous doctor who died in 1935. He was a very prominent person in the Vilna Jewish community. A lot of rabbis from different periods. Now, one of the stories is different. It's unique and a little bit out the beaten path. Here is the mark of the grave of Rabbi Baruch Ber Leibovitz. It's a special, interesting story how this grave was found and how it was renovated. The new headstone was erected. So Baruch Ber was a rabbi of the yeshiva in Kamenetz, and in 1940, when all the yeshivas were closed by the Soviet authorities, he and his pupils, boys from the yeshiva, they ran away to Vilnius, and he continued running the yeshiva in the underground way in Vilnius. He passed away in 1940, and the cemetery here was overfilled with stones. There was no place to bury another person. So, but what to do? They had to bury him, and they found an option to bury him on the path and not among other graves. So people knew the story that one grave on this cemetery should be a different direction. All the graves like that, and one grave like that. So many years passed till the technology allowed us to scan the land and to find the burials and other historical artifacts. And in 2014, a family from the United States paid for a specialist with a scanner to scan this cemetery, and they were lucky to find the actual spot where one grave was on the path and not among the other graves. That's how Leibovich's grave was located on this cemetery. Isn't it fascinating that we finally have one real location in all this huge area? So from the second cemetery to the new cemetery to the third one, and here we have few replicas of the graves from the oldest cemetery from which we have started. So this was the way. Now why here? because in 2003, when there was some construction on top of the old Jewish cemetery of Pyrmont in the center of Vilna, they found some remnants, some graves, and they reburied them to this location. Here is a mass grave of Bundists who participated in the revolutionary activities of the War of Independence 1916-1920, actually 1918-1920. So their names are mentioned here. Here is a memorial in honor of Hirsch Leckert, who tried to resist and to protest against the decision of the governor of Vilna city, von Wahl, to punish the demonstrants of the demonstration of May 1st, and he was caught for trying to kill von Wahl, and he was hanged on May 28th, 1902. And he was quite famous a certain period, and there was even a street by his name in Minsk, the capital city of Belarus, and in some other places. A very important tabernacle belongs to the Vilna Gaon and some other rabbis who were reburied from the oldest Jewish cemetery to the current Jewish cemetery, and this happened in 1953. In 1952, the old cemetery started to be finally desecrated and liquidated, and in 1953 they moved them. This tabernacle was erected a little bit later on, and above the entrance it says in Hebrew, Oy HaGra Vilna, kan ganuz rabam shel kol Israel, Gaon Rabbeinu Eliyahu ve'mishpachto. And also there is one word about Ger Tzedek. So it says that the Vilna Gaon and his family members were reburied here, and also the Ger Tzedek. Ger Tzedek is a story of Count Valentin Potocki, whom I've already mentioned earlier in the beginning of our episode. He lived at the times of the Vilna Gaon. He belonged to a Christian Catholic family of Polish-Lithuanian magnates, and he decided to convert to Judaism. At that time, it wasn't so easy to convert to Judaism, and he wasn't able to do it in Vilna. One day in Amsterdam, he met a rabbi and talked to him, and he asked if it would be possible to make a giyur. And the rabbi said, of course, yes, you stay and you study and you convert. So he stayed and studied and converted together with his friend Zaremba. Zaremba, according to our sources, moved to the Holy Land, to Israel, and Graf Potocki, or Avraham Ben Avraham by his new name, moved back to Lithuania and found a place not in Vilna, but in a small place, and he became a melamed, a teacher. And so he taught Aleph Bet to small children, and one day there was a conflict in uncertain circumstances, and he was given up by somebody to Jesuits who were persecuting those who betrayed Catholicism. He was brought back to Vilna, put on trial, and got death penalty, and was put on fire in 1747 or 49, something like that. Jews took some of the ashes from the fireplace and buried the ashes on the old Jewish cemetery. And there is a legend that Vilna Gaon said that he would like to be buried next to Ger Tzedek. In reality, it wasn't so. They were buried in separate places, but people knew this legend, and when they took the grave of the Vilna Gaon and moved it to the new cemetery, they put it next to they put them together. Moreinu Rabbeinu Parador Ve'adorei Maran Reb Chaim Oizer Grodzensky. He was one of the founders and the chairman of Agudat Israel, and also of the organization of yeshivot, the religious seminaries, and also the last rabbi of Vilna. Now, opposite his grave, we can see a few nameless headstones and one big stone in honor of Bundists. And one of them, Arkady Kremer, was the founder of Bund, which was a socialist organization founded in Vilnius in 1896. So there's a number of Bundists who took part in the revolutionary activities, and also 3 people from the cultural sphere of our life. And one of them, Shmuel Yosef Fin, who was the author of the book about Vilna, which was called Kiryat Ne'emana, which is a name of Jerusalem, but Vilna is famous for being called as the Jerusalem of Lithuania, or the northern Jerusalem, Yerushalayim Delita. But his book is a very serious work on the history of Vilna, and of course the history of Jewish Vilna. This is the grave of Itzele Ponevezher, or Yitzhak Rabinovich, who was the founder of Ponevezh Yeshiva, about which you can learn in our episode about Ponevezh city. So he was buried in Ponevezh, and the cemetery in Ponevezh was destroyed and desecrated in 1972. And the Jewish community succeeded to get the permission and to move his grave to the active cemetery in Vilna. By the way, there are more such graves which were moved from other places, from other towns, to this cemetery, which is active till nowadays, and people realize that Vilna community will remain. This is the grave of Dr. Tzemach Shabbat and his children. He was born in the 19th century, and he passed away in 1935. He was famous as a doctor and also as a social activist in the Vilnius community. And his friend Kornei Chukovsky wrote a book for children about a doctor, and something similar to Dr. Dolittle. And this book became very famous, and it was translated into many languages, about 29 languages. And in this way, Dr. Tzemach Shabbat became famous in many countries. So his family survived the Holocaust, and they initiated the transition of his grave from the second cemetery to the current Jewish cemetery of Vilna. These are 4 rows of nameless graves which are just to the Vilna Gaon's grave. These are 96 or 97 children who were killed by the Nazi and their local accomplices on this cemetery, so not everybody was taken to Ponar forest. And the community decided, after the exhumation of the mass grave, they've decided to put them without names, of course, because there was no chance to understand, to know the names. And this is a memorial in honor of all the people of Vilna ghetto who died and were never buried in a proper way. So we showed you the oldest Jewish cemetery of Vilna, the second Jewish cemetery of Vilna, and now we are finishing our episode on the current active cemetery of Vilna Jews. And this is an integral part of our history, our heritage, our life, the circle of life, and so on. So I think these places are important to visit. Unfortunately, for those who are interested in finding graves of their ancestors from pre-Second World War in Vilna, we can't offer much, but we can tell the story.